The biting Montana wind whipped through the train depot, carrying the scent of pine and desperation. Alice clung to her trembling, frail mother, expecting the towering, scarred mountain man to turn them both away. Instead, Jagger Green locked his cold grey eyes on them and uttered the words that would change everything. The year was 1887, and the Missoula train depot was little more than a muddy scar against the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Montana Territory. Jagger Green stood at the edge of the wooden platform, his broad shoulders easily parting the sea of bustling prospectors, cattlemen, and drifters. At 34, Jagger was a man carved from the very granite of the Bitterroot Mountains, tall, broad-chested, with a thick beard and a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, a parting gift from a grizzly bear 3 winters prior. He had paid $50 to the matrimonial agency of St. Louis for a strong, capable wife. The letters exchanged had been brief, practical, and devoid of romance. He needed a partner to help him run his high-altitude homestead, someone to salt the meat, tend the fires, and break the crushing silence of the mountain winter. He expected a sturdy, farm-raised woman. When the Northern Pacific steam engine finally screeched to a halt, spewing a cloud of dark soot into the freezing October air, Jagger watched the passengers disembark. His steely gaze narrowed when he spotted the woman clutching a battered leather valise, her knuckles white. She wore a faded blue wool coat that was far too thin for the mountain climate. This was Alice Mercer. She was undeniably beautiful, with pale skin, sharp cheekbones, and dark, frightened eyes. But she looked fragile. Worse, she was not alone. Leaning heavily against Alice's side was an elderly woman, her face deeply lined with age and illness. She coughed into a lace handkerchief, her frame shivering violently in the biting crosswind. Jagger stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks. He stopped a few feet from them, his sheer size casting a long shadow over the 2 women. "Alice Mercer," he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the hissing of the train. Alice swallowed hard, her chin lifting in a desperate show of defiance. "I am. And you must be Mr. Green." Jagger's eyes shifted to the elderly woman. "The agency didn't mention a passenger." "This is my mother, Ruth," Alice said, her voice trembling slightly, though her gaze never dropped from his. I could not leave her in Philadelphia. She has a weakness of the lungs. The doctors said the mountain air might save her." Alice took a shallow breath, preparing for the rejection she was certain was coming. "Mr. Green, I will work twice as hard. I will do the chores of 3 women. But where I go, my mother goes. If she cannot go, I cannot stay." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The wind howled, pulling at the hem of Alice's dress. Jagger stared at the frail old woman. He knew the brutal reality of the Bitterroots. The mountain was entirely unforgiving. It did not suffer weakness. Bringing an ailing elder into his cabin just weeks before the heavy snows hit was a fool's errand. It meant extra mouths to feed, extra wood to chop, and a high probability of digging a frozen grave before spring. Ruth looked up at him, her eyes clouded, but sharp with a fierce, protective maternal instinct. "I am not a burden, Mr. Green," she wheezed. "I can mend. I can pluck chickens. I will not eat much." Jagger looked from the dying mother to the desperate, fiercely loyal daughter. He had lived alone for 7 years, surviving on harsh pragmatism, but looking at the 2 women standing in the freezing mud, something deep within his chest shifted. He reached out with a massive, calloused hand. Alice flinched, expecting him to grab her bag and toss it back onto the train. Instead, Jagger took the heavy valise from her trembling grip. He unbuttoned his thick, fur-lined buffalo coat, revealing the wool flannel beneath, and wrapped the massive, heavy garment around the shivering shoulders of Ruth Mercer. The trail up Lolo Peak is steep. Jagger said, his tone flat, betraying no emotion. My home has room for both, but the wagon only goes halfway. After that we ride mules. Keep up. Alice let out a shuddering breath, tears of pure relief stinging her eyes. She gripped her mother's arm, and together they followed the towering mountain man into the wilderness. The journey was a grueling nightmare. For the first 2 days, they rode in a springless wagon over rutted, bone-jarring timber trails. The towering pines closed in around them, blocking out the sun and plunging the forest into a damp, perpetual twilight. By the 3rd day, the trail vanished, entirely replaced by a steep, rocky incline that only sure-footed mules could navigate. Throughout the grueling trek, Jagger was a silent, imposing guardian. He spoke rarely, but his actions spoke volumes. When the incline became too steep for Ruth to stay in the saddle, Jagger walked beside her mule, his massive hand steadying her back. When they made camp at night, he built a roaring fire and handed Alice tin cups of rich hot venison broth before tending to his own needs. Alice watched him from across the firelight, her preconceived notions of a savage, uncultured brute melting away. There was a quiet dignity to Jagger Green, a deep well of patience she hadn't expected. Yet as she stared into the flames, a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Jagger had accepted her and her mother under the assumption that they were simply poor, desperate women seeking a new life. He didn't know the real reason she had fled Philadelphia in the dead of night. He didn't know they were being hunted. Jagger's homestead was a fortress of hand-hewn cedar logs perched on a sheltered plateau near the snow line of Lolo Peak. It was rugged and functional, with a massive stone hearth, a heavy iron cook stove, and walls lined with traps pelts and Winchester rifles. To Jagger it was a sanctuary. To Alice, accustomed to the brick row houses of Philadelphia, it felt like the edge of the world. For the first 3 weeks, the arrangement worked surprisingly well. The sheer necessity of survival forced them into a seamless routine. Alice proved true to her word. She worked relentlessly. She learned to split kindling without driving the axe into her own shin. She learned to bake heavy sourdough bread, and she learned how to dress the rabbits and grouse Jagger brought home. Ruth, wrapped in a thick wool blanket by the roaring hearth, seemed to miraculously rally. The crisp, thin mountain air, free from the suffocating coal smog of the city, eased the violent rattling in her chest. She spent her days mending Jagger's torn flannel shirts and thick wool socks, humming old hymns. Jagger watched them both with a quiet, unreadable expression. His silent cabin was suddenly filled with the smell of baking bread, the soft murmur of female voices, and the warmth of a family he had never asked for, but was slowly realizing he didn't want to lose. He found himself lingering at the cabin in the mornings, taking extra time to whittle a new handle for Alice's cast-iron skillet, or secretly bringing back late-season huckleberries just to see the rare, brilliant smile light up Alice's face. But the mountain has a way of stripping away secrets, and the peace of the green cabin was built on a foundation of lies. The fracture occurred in mid-November, just as the first heavy blizzards began to threaten the peaks. Alice had gone out to the frozen creek to fetch water, leaving her bedroom door ajar. Jagger, noticing that the brass hinge on Alice's heavy travel trunk had sprung loose, decided to fix it while she was out. As he tightened the screws, he noticed the inner lining of the trunk was oddly raised. His calloused fingers probed the velvet fabric, finding a hidden latch. It popped open, revealing a false bottom. Jagger's breath caught. Inside the compartment lay a heavy leather pouch and a folded piece of newspaper. He untied the pouch. Bundles of crisp, large-denomination banknotes tumbled into his broad palm. It was easily $1,000, a staggering, impossible fortune for a woman who claimed to be destitute. With a rising sense of betrayal, Jagger unfolded the newspaper clipping. It was a recent edition of the Philadelphia Ledger. The bold ink seemed to scream up at him. Wanted bank clerk Alice Mercer, sought for embezzlement. Warrants issued. The article detailed the theft of over $5,000 from the First Mercantile Bank, naming Alice as the sole suspect who had fled the city under the cover of darkness. Jagger's jaw clenched so tight his teeth ground together. Out here, a man's word was his life. Trust was the only thing standing between survival and a frozen death. He had brought a fugitive into his home. A thief. When Alice returned to the cabin, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold, and carrying 2 heavy pails of water, she stopped dead in the doorway. Jagger was sitting at the heavy oak dining table. The leather pouch and the newspaper clipping rested on the wood between them. The color drained entirely from Alice's face. The heavy water pails slipped from her numb fingers, crashing to the floorboards and sending icy water pooling across the room. "Jem," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first time she had used his given name. $1,000. Jagger said, his voice terrifyingly quiet, devoid of the gentle rumble she had grown used to. And a warrant for a thief. Care to explain why I shouldn't ride down to Missoula right now and hand you over to the territorial marshal? Ruth stirred violently from her rocking chair by the fire, struggling to stand. "Mr. Green, please do not judge her. It is my fault." "Hush, Mother," Alice said, fiercely, stepping forward, stepping over the spilled water. She walked to the table, her whole body trembling, but she refused to look away from Jagger's furious, icy stare. "I am not a thief," Alice stated, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror in her eyes. "The man who took that money was Josiah Gentry. He was the bank manager and my superior." Jagger crossed his massive arms. "The paper says otherwise. Because Josiah owns the paper, and the police chief and half the judges in Philadelphia," Alice cried out, her composure finally cracking. "I found his ledger. I found where he had been skimming from the accounts of widows and immigrants. When I confronted him, he laughed. He told me that if I went to the authorities, he would frame me. He said no one would believe a lowly female clerk over a respected society man." She pointed a trembling finger at the leather pouch. "He offered me a choice. Take $1,000 of his stolen money and leave the state forever. Or stay, and he would have me arrested, thrown in prison, and my mother thrown into an asylum." Tears finally spilled over her dark eyelashes, tracking down her pale cheeks. What was I supposed to do, Jagger? My mother was dying in that city. We had no family, no powerful friends. I took the devil's money. I paid the matrimonial agency, bought train tickets, and we ran. I am guilty of taking his bribe to survive, but I am not a thief." Jagger stared at her, analyzing every micro-expression on her face. He had seen liars before. The West was full of snake oil salesmen and cutthroats, but he also knew the look of a trapped animal, doing whatever it took to keep its young alive. He looked over at Ruth, who was weeping silently by the fire. Slowly, Jagger reached out and dragged the newspaper clipping toward him. He crumpled it in his massive fist and tossed it into the roaring hearth. $1,000 is a lot of money to leave behind, Jagger finally said, his voice softening just a fraction. A man like Josiah Gentry doesn't strike me as someone who lets a loose end wander the country with $1,000 of his money and knowledge of his ledgers. Alice swallowed hard, wiping her face. I hoped Montana was far enough away. I changed my name on the agency registry. I used my middle name. It's not far enough, Jagger said, grimly standing up. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire cabin. Men like that, men with money and pride, they don't stop hunting. If he finds out you used an agency—" Jagger didn't finish the thought. Instead, he walked over to the wall and pulled his heavy Winchester repeater from its pegs, checking the lever action. "Jem," Alice asked, fear spiking in her chest again. "What are you doing? Winter is coming, Alice," he said, turning back to her with a steely, protective glint in his eye. "We need supplies to last until the spring thaw. I'm going down to Missoula to buy flour, salt, and ammunition. I want you to bolt this door behind me. Do not open it for anyone." 2 days later, Jagger pushed his heavy draft horse through the worsening snow flurries into the muddy streets of Missoula. He secured his supplies, loading up a pack mule. Before leaving, he stepped into the warmth of the Iron Horse Saloon for a cup of black coffee to warm his bones for the ride back up the peak. As he stood at the mahogany bar, the barkeep slid his cup over and leaned in close. "Rough weather to be heading back up, Lolo Jem," the barkeep muttered. "Say you had a mail-order bride come in a few weeks back, right?" Jagger's grip on his coffee cup tightened until his knuckles turned white. "What of it?" "Just watch your back," the barkeep whispered, wiping a rag across the wood. "There was an Easterner in here yesterday. Fancy suit, wore a silk tie and a silver pocket watch. He was asking around about 2 women matching the description of yours. Said he was a family friend, worried about their health. But the man was carrying a custom-engraved Colt revolver under that expensive coat. He bought a map of the valley, and he asked specifically about the trails leading up Lolo Peak." Jagger left a silver dollar on the bar and walked out into the freezing storm. The past had finally caught up to them, and the mountain was about to run red. The ride back up Lolo Peak was a treacherous battle against nature and time. The sky turned a bruised, violent purple, unleashing a furious blizzard that swallowed the towering pines in a blinding sheet of white. Jagger spurred his massive draft horse Goliath, abandoning the slow-moving pack mule in a sheltered ravine, with enough feed to survive the night. He packed the essential ammunition, flour, and salt into Goliath's saddlebags and rode hard. Every instinct, honed by years in the bitter wilderness, screamed at him that he was being followed. The Easterner the barkeep had mentioned, a man with custom iron and a silk tie, would not wait for spring. A man paid by Josiah Gentry to clean up loose ends would use the storm to his advantage, knowing the local law would not dare ascend the mountain in such weather. It was long past nightfall when Jagger finally broke through the tree line onto the plateau. The cabin was a dark silhouette against the driving snow, save for a thin, desperate sliver of golden light leaking from the heavy wooden shutters. Jagger practically threw himself from the saddle, leading Goliath into the adjoining barn and securing the heavy iron latch. He waded through thigh-deep snow, the wind howling like a wounded animal, and pounded his fist heavily against the cabin door. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 2 more, the signal he had taught Alice before he left. The heavy iron bolt scraped back, and the door swung open just enough for Jagger to force his massive frame inside. The wind roared into the cabin, threatening to extinguish the hearth fire, before Alice slammed the door shut and threw the bolt home. She turned to him, her eyes wide with terror and relief. She had a heavy iron poker clutched in her trembling hands. Behind her, Ruth sat rigid in her chair, clutching a worn leather Bible. "Jem!" Alice gasped, dropping the poker. She threw her arms around his waist, burying her face in his frozen, snow-caked coat. It was an instinctual gesture of pure relief, one that sent a jolt of unexpected warmth straight through his chest. He rested his large, gloved hand tentatively on her dark hair for a fleeting second, before his survival instincts took over. He gently pushed her back. "We have company on the mountain." The blood drained from Alice's face. "He found us. A hired gun." Jagger confirmed, grimly stripping off his frozen coat and moving straight to the wall of rifles. He pulled down a heavy Sharps buffalo rifle and a double-barreled shotgun, checking the breeches of both. He was asking questions in Missoula. He's likely on the trail right now. The snow will slow him down, but if he's a professional, he won't stop. "He will kill us!" Ruth wheezed from the corner, her voice trembling. "Mr. Green, you must give us to him. He wants the money, and Alice. You have no part in this." Jagger paused slowly, turning to look at the frail old woman, then at Alice, who stood defiant despite her fear. "I bought a wife, Mrs. Mercer." Jagger said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the sound of the storm. "And the agency contract said, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer. The way I see it, you are my family now, and no city-slicking gun thug comes onto my mountain and threatens my family." He turned to Alice, pressing the heavy double-barreled shotgun into her hands. "Do you know how to fire this?" Alice swallowed hard, feeling the cold, oiled steel. "Pull the hammers back. Aim for the center of mass. Pull the triggers." "Good," Jagger said. "Sit away from the windows. If that door breaks open, you don't hesitate. You fire." The siege began in agonizing silence. For hours there was nothing but the shriek of the wind and the crackle of the hearth. Jagger sat in the dark by the front window, peering through a small crack in the shutters. The cold seeped into their bones. Just before dawn, the wind died down, leaving an eerie, suffocating stillness over the mountain. Then came the sound. A sharp, distinct crack of a branch breaking beneath a heavy boot, followed by the low, agitated whinny of Goliath from the barn. Jagger tensed. "He's here!" A voice called out from the darkness, smooth, cultured, and dripping with malice. "Alice Mercer, it is a terribly cold night to be playing hide-and-seek." Alice clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. She recognized that voice. It was Elias Cobb, Josiah Gentry's chief enforcer. He was a ruthless man, known for making problems disappear into the muddy waters of the Delaware River. "Josiah sends his regards." Cobb's voice echoed, seeming to come from all sides as he circled the cabin. "He wants his ledger back. He wants his money. And he wants to see you hang. But I'm a reasonable man, Alice. Send out the money, and maybe I let the old mountain man live. Keep it inside, and I'll burn this cabin to the ground with all three of you in it. You have 5 seconds to step off my property." Jagger roared through the thick timber of the door, his voice echoing over the snowdrifts. Elias Cobb laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Or what woodsman you'll hit me with an axe?" The response was a deafening roar. A slug from Cobb's heavy revolver ripped through the wooden shutter, sending deadly splinters flying across the room. Jagger ducked wood fragments raining down on his shoulders. He immediately shoved the barrel of his Winchester through the splintered hole and fired blindly into the dark, racking the lever and firing twice more. The exchange of gunfire shattered the silence of the dawn. Bullets thudded heavily into the thick cedar logs of the cabin. Cobb was moving quickly, firing from behind the cover of the snow-laden pine trees. He was trying to find a weak point, trying to force them out into the cold. "He's moving toward the chimney," Jagger shouted, tracking the sound of crunching snow. "If he clogs the flue, the smoke will choke us out." Jagger made a split-second decision. "Bolt the door behind me." Before Alice could protest, Jagger threw open the heavy oak door and dove out into the freezing, knee-deep snow, rolling as a bullet clipped the doorframe where his head had just been. Alice slammed the door shut, throwing her weight against it, and sliding the iron bolt back into place, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Outside, the air was bitter enough to freeze the breath in Jagger's lungs. He scrambled behind the frozen woodpile, racking the lever of his Winchester. In the pale grey light of the breaking dawn, he caught a glimpse of movement near the side of the cabin. Elias Cobb was tall, wearing a thick wool overcoat ruined by the trek, his face wrapped in a dark scarf. He had a torch in one hand, freshly lit from a waterproof match, and a revolver in the other. He was heading straight for the cordwood stacked against the cabin's foundation. Jagger stood up, aiming down the sights. "Drop the torch, city boy!" Cobb whipped around, firing wildly. A bullet tore through the fleshy part of Jagger's left shoulder, spinning the massive mountain man backward into the snow. The Winchester slipped from his grasp, buried beneath the fresh powder. Pain flared white-hot through Jagger's arm. He scrambled backward as Cobb advanced, a wicked, triumphant smile visible above his scarf. "Should have stayed inside, woodsman," Cobb sneered, raising his revolver, aiming directly at Jagger's chest. "Josiah pays double for no witnesses." Inside the cabin, Alice heard the muffled exchange. She heard the agonizing grunt of pain from Jagger. The shotgun felt impossibly heavy in her hands, but the image of Jagger bleeding out in the snow ignited a fierce, desperate rage within her. This man had taken them in. He had fought for them. She would not let another man destroy her life. Alice unbolted the door and kicked it open. Cobb spun around at the noise. He had a split second to register the petite, terrified woman, standing on the porch, her nightgown billowing under her unbuttoned coat, holding a massive double-barreled shotgun braced against her hip. "Leave him alone!" Alice screamed. She pulled both triggers simultaneously. The recoil was massive, throwing Alice violently backward onto the hardwood floor of the cabin. The twin blasts roared like thunder across the mountain valley, a brilliant flash of fire lighting up the gloomy dawn. The buckshot tore through the air, catching Elias Cobb squarely in the chest and shoulder. The hired gun was lifted off his feet by the sheer force of the impact, thrown backward into a deep snowbank. The torch flew from his hand, hissing as it landed in the snow, and died. Silence, heavy and absolute, rushed back to claim the mountain. Jagger clutched his bleeding shoulder, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. He hauled himself up and stumbled over to where Cobb lay. The enforcer's eyes were wide, staring blankly up at the falling snow. He was dead. Jagger turned back toward the cabin. Alice was crawling on her hands and knees toward the doorway, her shoulder bruised and her ears ringing from the blast, but her eyes were searching desperately for him. Jagger staggered up the porch steps and dropped to his knees beside her. He pulled her into a tight, fierce embrace with his good arm. Alice buried her face in his neck, finally sobbing as the adrenaline left her system. "It's over," Jagger rasped against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "He's gone. You're safe." Ruth appeared in the doorway, tears streaming down her weathered face, holding a clean linen towel to bind Jagger's wound. The aftermath was grim but necessary. Jagger survived the gunshot wound thanks to Ruth's careful nursing and Alice's stubborn refusal to let him overexert himself. Once the spring thaw finally broke the mountain's icy grip in late April, Jagger packed Cobb's body onto the mule and took him down the mountain, turning him over to the federal marshals in Missoula, along with the stolen ledger Alice had hidden in her trunk. The ledger was the key. It proved Josiah Gentry's massive embezzlement scheme. By the time summer arrived, Gentry was in a federal penitentiary, his empire of corruption dismantled. The $1,000 Alice had taken was quietly deemed unrecoverable by the authorities, a silent reward for the mountain man and his wife who had brought down the corrupt banker. When Jagger returned to the cabin, the snows had fully melted, revealing a vibrant carpet of green grass and wildflowers. Alice was sitting on the porch, peeling potatoes, while Ruth sat in her rocking chair, soaking in the warm sun, her cough a distant memory. Jagger walked up the steps, dropping his heavy saddlebags. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple silver band. He had bought it in Missoula. He knelt in front of Alice, taking her small, rough hand in his massive one. The agency contract was just paper. Jagger said, his grey eyes, soft, stripped of their usual stoic coldness. I don't want a business arrangement anymore. I want a wife. I want my family. If you'll truly have me. Alice smiled, tears pricking her eyes as she looked from the ring to the scarred, gentle giant who had saved them. I already have you, Jem. Forever. He slipped the ring onto her finger, sealing a bond forged in ice blood and an unyielding love that even the harshest winter could not break. Did you love this gritty tale of survival and romance in the untamed West? If Jagger and Alice's journey kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share this story with your fellow Western drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired frontier tales. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload.